I think for many of us, certainly of my generation, Hermann Hesse and his writing was important. A very, what can I say? It was something in the air at the time, the zeitgeist of the time, and many of us read all Hermann Hesse's books with great enthusiasm and avidity, and some of us, it even got us interested in Far Eastern religion and Eastern religion, particularly in Buddhism. Certainly, that was to some extent my story. So I'm really thrilled, actually, tonight that we're going to be looking much more deeply into the life of Hermann Hesse. But he was very much a person of his time and the influences of his time. But I don't want to say too much because this is for Alexander Maitland, our special guest today, who will be talking on this subject. It's very nice to see the first edition here of Siddhartha, and the title of tonight's talk is Hermann Hesse and Siddhartha. So, Alexander, it's lovely to see you. It's wonderful to have you back at the Society. And thank you so much for coming out. Fortunately, it's not too cold today, but it's lovely to see you. Alexander is a writer, author, traveler, and has given us many talks in the past. So can I give you a big welcome? Thank you so much.
Thank you, Desmond. As you just said, Desmond, it's a great pleasure for me because I love books and used to collect them seriously. And this, of course, is the first edition of Siddhartha, published in Germany, or published and in German indeed, obviously, in 1922, exactly 100 years ago. And it's a most beautiful work, not very long, less than 120 pages, but it's really a prose poem. And indeed, Hermann Hesse subtitled it in German, Eine Indische Dichtung, an Indian poem. And that was what he had in mind. So I think today what I'd like to try to do is just to sketch, and I emphasize sketch, some of Hermann Hesse's life, right from his birth at Karp in the Black Forest in July 1877, up to and including the publication date of Siddhartha, a book which he began to write in 1919, just after the First World War. Hesse's upbringing and to some extent the life that he led as a boy and an adolescent up to his maturity influenced his work from, I suppose, the 1890s forwards, and particularly his prose works, which began with Peter Kamenzind in 1904. But by the time he got to writing Siddhartha, he was still on the way, very much on the way. He would have said the beginnings of a journey that had started when he was as young as 4 or 5 years old. And it was a journey in pursuit of self-fulfillment. Can you believe it? For a child of that age, he thought like that. And above all, self-revelation. And he wanted to understand what everything meant. And there's a reason for all of this. I'll start with his mother, but his mother, Maria Gundert, was born at Talacheri in India, just south of Mysore, in the Western Ghats in India, in 1842. Her father, Dr. Hermann Gundert, was a famous, renowned Indologist, and he translated the Bible into the local lingua franca, Malayalam, and also wrote an English Malayalam dictionary. And he spoke 20 languages fluently and wrote in them, including 4 or 5 European languages, but 15 South Indian dialects and languages. So that was very much his focus. But his range of interest and activity went beyond Hindu religion and culture. And in fact, he became absorbed with Buddhism and Buddhist works, and with Jain, and also Taoism to some extent, although that wasn't so much such importance to him. His daughter, Hermann Hesse's mother, lived in India for 4 years. She was then sent back to school, which is quite common with children of evangelists and preachers of the missionary societies. And she remained in school in Germany until she was about 15, and then she begged her parents to bring her back to India. She wasn't at all a happy child. And I have a feeling that this sort of disease, if you like, in the sense of dis-ease with life, was something which had transmitted itself to her son Hermann. I think that he was very close to his mother. He shared her love of music and poetry and so on. And I think that that discomfort, if you like, with childhood was something that he picked up on very early. But coming back for a moment to Maria, she married for the first time in India to a church missionary society, evangelist missionary called Karl Eisenberg, who was very famous, wrote books about Abyssinia, Shoa, other places, Western India. He was a linguist. But they had 3 children, of whom 2 survived, 2 boys. And sadly, but not uncommonly, a few years after the children were born, Karl Eisenberg died in India, and Maria inevitably came back to Germany with Theodore and Karl, her 2 sons. When she got back, she lived with her parents at Kalp, as I say, in the Black Forest, where Hermann was born. And after about a year, she married another missionary called Johannes Hesse, who was a Baltic German from Estonia, where his father was a highly respected doctor. Johannes Hesse had been invalided out of India from Malabar, and hence had been returned to Germany, where he was given employment at Kalp in the Basel Missionary Society's publishing house at Kalp. And there he worked for Maria's father, Dr. Gundert, who had likewise returned with his wife from India some years before and was assistant or associate director of the publishing house. So Maria, I must call her Maria, it's much easier. Maria and Johannes produced 6 children, of whom 4 survived. Adele, their eldest child, 2 years older than Hermann, and of course Hermann, the great writer, in 1877. Hermann Hesse was brought up, therefore, in an extraordinarily ecumenical family setting. On the one hand, the Hesses were pietist, evangelist Lutherans, pietist in the sense that they took the word of the Christian doctrine and the moral Christian code very literally indeed, and it was immensely strict and quite inflexible. But at the same time, their experience and exposure to Hinduism, Buddhism, Taoism, and so forth in India, and to the linguistics associated with these languages, and their life in India, broadened the spectrum, the religious background and spectrum within the family setting. And this, of course, had a tremendously important influence on Hermann. He was a very clever child. I mean, he showed immediate talent, and to the point of being precocious. But there was also a rebellious streak in his nature. There was something not quite right, something not quite balanced there. And he, of course, had no idea as a child what was going on. He simply responded to situations as any child would. But when his parents began to talk about religion seriously, and he would say to his mother or father, you know, but what else is there apart from Christianity, surely? I mean, you have Buddhism, and this is as a little boy, it's extraordinary. You have Buddhism and you have the philosophy of Lao Tse and so forth, and but surely these are important too. Where do these lead? You know, you're saying that we must follow the Christian religion, I mean, to its letter, but surely these others have a place too. And of course, at that point, his parents would close down on him, and they would say, well, Hermann, really, that's all very well, but your father translates, Johannes, your father translates Buddhist prayers, for example, and recites them, and I know you love hearing those. And his mother, your mother, I'm delighted to tell you about the life that we had in India, and endless numbers of stories. But at the same time, your father and I are both Lutherans, like your grandfather and your grandmother. And this is the path that we follow, and this is the path that we expect you and your sister and brothers to follow too. And he couldn't cope with that. He absolutely couldn't cope with that. And he became increasingly difficult. In fact, in his Nobel Prize address, which he wasn't able to give himself because of his health, but gave someone to read for him, he described himself as a boy, a small boy, who was difficult to manage. And he knew that was an understatement. And indeed, of course, it was. But he didn't know why. Nor indeed did his mother, and nor did his father. It got so difficult at one point that around this early age, when Hermann was 5, his father and mother seriously considered farming him out to another family and giving them the responsibility to bring him up. And he knew that this was going on. Failing that he would go to an institution of some kind, obviously a theological institution, something like a cloister school or something of that kind, of which there were many in Swabia. But what they didn't realize was the effect that these conversations had on their small son, because he felt increasingly and understandably rejected by both his parents. His father, who was generally fairly easygoing, as indeed was his maternal grandmother, who was French-Swiss, Julie Dubois. Oh, now, we should see some photographs of these things. I'm so sorry. We've lots of pictures to show, and I'm being very negligent. I'm bad at this. Where are the photographs? Thanks, Wando. You'll see a little bit of this now. Now, that's his mother on the left, who looks very like him. And there's Karl Eisenberg, who I've spoken about. And this is Johannes Hesse's father, the Estonian doctor, rather distinguished-looking man, Dr. Gundert, and Hermann's grandfather, the Indologist, and his mother, and his grandmother, his grandmother, Julie Dubois, and Hermann as a young man. I don't know how old he is there, but probably, what do you think, about 18, that sort of thing, possibly. Mm-hmm. Not much older. Mm. And then, now, if we can hold on that for a second, Wando, this extraordinary structure, believe it or not, photographed in Mecca. But there is some point to this. To make life a little easier for all of us, I think I could summarize Hermann Hesse's early education by saying that it was a stormy and rather disparate affair. He was transferred from school to school to school, starting in a Latin, theologically driven Latin establishment at Calf, and then on to various other schools, but all of the same background. And he always started well, and then he suddenly got bored. He was so intelligent that he got to the top of his form or class, whatever it was, with ease, and remained there for as long as he remained in the school. But time and time again, the pastor, whoever it was who was running the school, the clergyman, would report to his parents that he was beyond redemption, beyond help. He could do nothing with this boy, and he'd be transferred on somewhere else. And at one point, in actual fact, he was transferred to a school at Steppen where they specialized in retarded children and seriously mentally disturbed children because they didn't know what to do. And just quickly and in passing, because it's not without relevance, I always rather wondered what exactly was wrong with Hermann Hesse. And you know, I'm such a rotten researcher and so completely inept in these matters that it never occurred to me to bother to look it up or ask somebody who might be able to cast some light onto it. And I found out quite recently, and really as a result of being sort of shoehorned into doing this afternoon talk, which was a great pleasure anyway, I thought I really must get this thing answered for at least one very good reason that comes to mind, because of Desmond. And it turned out that Hermann Hesse suffered from type 2 bipolar disorder. That was it. And of course, he was somebody with Desmond's medical background and experience would find that immediately obvious, I'm sure. But hence the mood swings from elation and nervous irritation, extreme irritation, to utter depression. And because at that time, I gather, I didn't say I've been told, just as I say again in passing, as a footnote, but because the patient couldn't really explain to his doctor or psychiatrist what was going on, because he always made himself available at extreme moments, either at moments of nervous excitability and elation, or at moments of acute depression, because he wanted help. And that apparently was not a good idea from the point of view of getting the initial treatment going, or indeed the diagnosis. So going back to the turn of the last century, 1900, you can imagine that things, in spite of the rising tide of psychiatric psychiatric investigation by Joseph Lang and later with Jung, it was still in a fairly early state. I think early stage. Would that be a fair comment, Desmond?
Yes, it would. In fact, type 2 is a recent diagnostic criteria. In those days, it was really manic depression.
Yes,
That's what people were diagnosed.
Indeed.
But he wouldn't fall easily into that category.
No.
Because of the irritability.
So I gather the irritability. I gather that is that's one of the distinguishing features. Is it sort of what they call hypomania? Is that one of them?
Well, hypomania can sometimes demonstrate itself through irritability, extreme irritability, rather than elevated mood.
Yes, that's interesting. So the two are quite discernible in that way. Mm-hmm. Well, there it is. So there was the puzzle. So the parents didn't understand what was going on. The grandparents obviously didn't. His contemporaries didn't. And all importantly, nor did Hermann Hesse himself. He just knew that these things happened. But the interesting thing was that associated with all of that was the fact that he was and realized that he was a creative individual. He knew that he had more to do than his friends, his play friends and all the rest of it. But let's move on a little from there. We get to the stage where he's passed his examinations for the Schwabian education system. He's now been exposed to one of, or any of the four leading theological schools, including Maulbronn, which was an Abbey school, about the equivalent of Eton or Ampleforth or something like that in this country. And he was accepted and did extremely well from the point that he went in. And then suddenly everything went to pieces. And about the age of 15 or so, part of this puzzle that was going on inside his head, which was also a conflicted thing, which I've heard again described as dualism, so between, I suppose, emotion and mind and body, body and mind. He suddenly found himself falling head over heels in love with a girl 6 years older than himself. And of course, that was a big age difference. And he declared himself to her, and she was very nice. And she rejected him, but gently. But the rejection was just one thing too many. And so he went off and bought himself a revolver and wrote a suicide note and then vanished for a day. And you can imagine what the reaction to that was. But he returned after a day with the revolver, unused, perfectly all right, but in a pretty wrecked state. And he was sent home. And then the cycle of treatment and school and home life resumed. All of that came to an end when he passed his final examinations, which again, in spite of all of this, he did with ease. And he had to find something to do. He worked in a bookshop, first of all in Calf, and more or less enjoyed that, but that didn't last. And then he was apprenticed to a tower clock manufacturer called Perrot, which is still going strong. And this is one of their major productions, which is a tower clock designed and erected above the main hotel, Pilgrim Hotel complex in Mecca. It weighs 36,000 metric tons and has 4 faces. And the idea is that it gives the time of day for prayers and other purposes to the Islamic world. No matter where you are, you can focus in on this. Of course, Hesse had nothing to do with this, but he worked as an apprentice for Perrot for a year, just as a junior mechanic, and found it very dull and dreary. He then moved on and joined up with another bookseller in Tübingen, and that worked for a while. There, he became deeply involved in the aesthetic movement and began to read writers like Schlegel and Novalis and others associated with the movement and absorb all of that, and began to write, gradually began to write. His first writing included a little bit of prose, but was mainly poetry. And the influence, again, came directly from his mother, who wrote poetry, translated it, wrote biographies, including a biography of David Livingstone, the missionary, and she could do that bilingually, very easily, and did so. And indeed, with, just in the passing word, just with her father, Dr. Gundert, she actually wrote a biography of her first husband, Karl Eisenberg, which was published in English for the first time in the 1880s. But anyhow, the aesthetic movement was a phase, and of course it embraced poetry and romance, all the things that you could imagine an adolescent, creative adolescent who tended to look inwards rather than outwards, who lived in his dreams and his world, would immediately be drawn to. But the phase passed. He then moved, he decided that he would like to really get away from the immediate sort of family setting of Calf and Tübingen and so forth. And he moved to Basel, which he found a vibrant and interesting town to live in. He associated it immediately with Nietzsche, for example, who was very much the rage at that point. Nietzsche was interesting everybody, from composers like Frederick Delius to writers on the continent. And so he said, in retrospect, thinking back, that he always associated Basel with Burckhardt and Böcklin, and above all with Nietzsche. And he was happy there. I mean, he met friends of his family, he moved in artistic and literary circles, he began to write poetry, and eventually he put together a little collection of prose a story called, I think from memory, Heinrich Lauschen, which is an important stepping stone on the way to his first serious book. But poetry, a wonderful collection called An Hour Behind Midnight, which was a prose collection, and then a couple of hundred of his poems were published. But to his distress, and it's so easy to understand what's going on at this moment, he was devoted to both his parents, in spite of his father being strict, in spite of his mother being gentle and receptive. He was, because of that, he was devoted to both of them. And so you can just imagine his distress when he sent a copy of his collected poems to his mother, and she pronounced them to be bold, too bold, and above all, sinful. And that just pulled the rug straight out from underneath. You can just imagine. Anyway, in some extraordinary way, he drove himself forward, and he then produced more poetry and a little bit of prose work, which showed distinct promise. And as a result of that, by the turn of the century, he was spotted by a German publisher who invited him to produce something a little bit more advanced than just the prose fragments he was writing. And this was the beginning of his first all-important book, titled Peter Camenzind. Unfortunately, when another collection of verse was published just before he started seriously to work on the novel Camenzind, his mother died, and so she never saw the fruits of his more mature work. And this again was something that he found great difficulty in coping with. This all seems probably a very long way away from Siddhartha, which is the point of this afternoon's talk. We must get to that. And Odin, I wonder if it's possible. Yes, now, just quickly running through this. At the time that he wrote and published his first novel, Peter Camenzind, which was the first of a series of what the German literati describe as Bildungsroman, which is really the life path from childhood through adolescence to maturity, containing the all-important element of change and improvement. It must always have that. Camenzind was the first of these. It was a standard, almost standard formula about a young poet who lives in the mountains, who has a callous father, whose mother dies, who wants to experience the world and who disappears off and does exactly that. But in a sense, without fulfillment. He knows that he wants to find something fulfilling. He's looking for himself above all. It's a search for that. And in a sense, a search for what might be described, certainly in Buddhist terms, as enlightenment, but not quite that. It's fulfillment it's a different measure, somewhat. But essentially, I'm going down that road. And anyway, it produced enough money for him to marry, quite against her father's wishes, a daughter of the famous mathematicians, Maria Bernoulli, whom he had met in Italy. And that's another view of Mia, or Maria, as she was called, rather masculine-looking woman. And if we could hold that one, do please, for a second. So they married, and they went off to live in Geinhofen on the Untersee, the sort of the southern lake that makes up Lake Constance, and lived in a very happy, bucolic sort of way, rural way. Hesse wrote and painted and wrote, and produced another novel titled Gertrude, after his younger sister, which again followed the same line, essentially of, broken marriage, distressed children, and so forth. I mean, he was getting all of this out of his own system and trying to understand it in the process of writing about it. And so their marriage trailed on rather. They produced 3 sons, Bruno, Halder, and Martin. And by about 1910, when he wrote another book, Rosalda, which described their marriage at this point very accurately indeed. and which incidentally he regarded as one of his best literary creations of all time. He thought when he got to 1910 he had done it. He never read anything better than Roshalda. But when he got to that stage, married life was in a state of extreme distress, and he was finding it, and as his wife was finding it, enormously difficult. What he didn't realize was that in the meantime, his wife Maria was beginning to suffer from the first early symptoms of schizophrenia. So to be married like that with somebody suffering from schizophrenia, somebody else from incipient bipolar disorder, it was a bit of a tinderbox mixture. And it was difficult to see in retrospect how it could ever really have worked out for the benefit of the two people concerned and indeed their children. Anyway, to solve that, he decided that he would go back a little to his childhood and his upbringing involving this huge spectrum of religious thought: Christianity, Buddhism, Hinduism, Taoism, Jain, all these things. Some of which he had begun to discover, particularly Buddhism, he had already begun to discover by reading, in addition to Goethe, Nietzsche, and so forth, reading Schopenhauer. And Schopenhauer's philosophy, of course, was very much connected with the thirst that we should really try to resist, and the ascendancy of the will and the self, and to try to tone that down and gradually disperse it altogether. So he felt the answer to this would be to go to India, which he never actually did, but he did go to Ceylon and Malaysia and Sumatra on a 3-month cruise with a friend of his, a slightly older friend, a painter of some renown called Hans Stolzenegger. And here you see them on board their vessel, the name of which I can't remember, doesn't really much matter. But there is Hesse in the middle, I think, and Stolzenegger beside him and somebody else, another friend. And this is at the beginning of their voyage. Now, the figure on the left, I must confess, I'm not absolutely certain of. It certainly isn't. I'm sure it's not Hermann Hesse. It's completely wrong for him. And I really have no idea, but it's someone anyway of some importance. But here we have a little group which I imagine was photographed in Sri Lanka, perhaps in the north of the island, which is the nearest he got to South India, just right on the borderline between the island and the tail of India. So all of these are involved in that 1911 period. But when he came back, he told his friends and he realized himself that his quest for fulfillment, for enlightenment, for self-knowledge, his quest for a better understanding of Buddhism, and even of Chinese-related traditions, which were also predominant in the family household, that had been a complete failure because, as he said, I should be able to find all of this, and I can find all of this inside myself. I don't have to go to India. I don't have to go to Sumatra or China or anywhere else. I can find it all inside me. And that was terribly important. That was a stepping stone again to the ultimate realization that it was a doable thing. So he returned from Ceylon on this voyage with Stolzenegger. He returned with these important thoughts, promising thoughts in his mind. He wanted to do more with them, but not just at that moment, because two things happened. First, he found his marriage in an even worse state than he had left it, and more or less on top of that began the First World War. And although he was essentially a pacifist and really believed that he could be a good man, but didn't necessarily have to die in order to be one, he, in spite of all of that, volunteered for active service. And because of his state of health, which was, apart from his mental condition, was not particularly good. He had arthritis, he suffered from persistent and very severe headaches, much, much more than the thing that people always complain about, the name of which I've now completely forgotten, when you have headaches all the time. and people have to lie in darkened rooms to recover from them. But he had all of that going on, and the army said, no, you can't do this. So they put him in charge of what I described in the little sketch in the middle way as enemy prisoners, but in fact, German prisoners, German soldiers who were enemy captives in other countries like France. So that was what he did during the First War. To get his feelings, nevertheless, out of his system, he began to write about war. And he wrote an impassioned piece in German called, "Oh, friends, not this tone. Oh, Freunde, nicht diese Tone." And this came straight from his heart. And needless to say, he was called a wretch, a traitor, everything under the sun. He was vilified, he was sent hate mail, and his life was made completely intolerable. But he persisted. Round about 1915 or 16, however, the whole thing became too much, and he was released from the army. And at that point, he began, I think on advice from another friend, not just from himself, but he began to take advice from Joseph Lang, who was a student and a disciple and a close friend of Carl Jung. And Lang encouraged him to draw and paint things he had liked to do as a child, things which had a calming and fulfilling influence, painting which he did for the rest of his life, right up until his very last years. Became a tremendous solace, and indeed it's something at which he was very, very good. And on top of that, he began to see a way through the treatment that he was having and the talks he was having with Joseph Lang, he began to understand how to approach and confront the problems by having them opened up to him and not just beating against a closed door all the time that he didn't understand. And this is vitally important. And indeed, it was one of the triggers that enabled him to think in such terms as left him able to create Siddhartha and come back to the idea of Buddhism and Siddhartha and the journey, the life journey, in the way that he did 3 years later in 1919. His marriage continued to deteriorate, but in 1919, he moved with his wife and children from Geinhofen, which was beautiful, right on the edge of the lake, but a rather kind of, I don't know, a lackluster place as far as Hesse was concerned. It wasn't a great place to work in. And they moved to a larger house with a beautiful garden. He loved gardening, just like his paternal grandfather, who spent his entire life gardening, apart from being a doctor. And he was very happy. He wrote poetry, he wrote stories, he wrote another novel or two, Demian, an important novel, again on the principle of the seeker and the companion. And a very important book, I think, which isn't often nowadays, I think, read very seriously, Klingsor's Last Summer, which interested me purely and solely, not least because Klingsor, of course, is the magician in Wolfram von Eschenbach, the 13th century High German poet's story, famous story, Parsifal, adapted as an opera by Richard Wagner. He even uses the name in one of his novels. He uses the name Richard for somebody, for a musician who dies to his grief, or the grief of the character. And I've no doubt in my mind that he's talking about Wagner here, because he uses his family names all over the place, names of his friends, names of important people, and of course himself. All of his novels are essentially autobiographical. If I could use the expression, Desmond, without making a fool of myself, psychologically autobiographical rather than autobiographical in the accepted and broad, perhaps, other sense. So they move to the canton, or cantonment of Ticino, if that's correctly pronounced, and to a little village whose name translates as a rough-hewn specimen who lives in mountains, Montagnola, but feminized to Montagnola. And that was on the lake in Ticino. And there he entered a happy and tranquil and creative and wonderful period of his life. And it was then and there that he began to try to write Siddhartha. And boy, was that a difficult task. Even Hesse, who at that time had passed into a different literary sort of state after Roshalder. He was confident about his powers as a writer. He knew better, but not completely better, but he knew more or less where he was going. But faced with the problem of writing about the young Brahmin from Kashlaba, from Nepal, and his father and everything that was happening, which again evolves as a more or less biographical, autobiographical image of Hesse himself. He got as far as the first and shorter section of the book, helped very largely by a French writer, another Nobel Prize winner, in fact, called Romain Rolland. And Romain Rolland was much older than Hesse, but he wrote to him in 1915, got to know him, and helped him to start writing Siddhartha. And before I sketch the story, which I'm sure you all know probably better than I do, I should just mention also that he had help, important help, at the two important stages of writing this novel. As I say, the first was helped by the French writer, the French literary man, Rolland. And the second, and desperately important piece of help, if you like, or help that he received, was from his cousin Wilhelm Gundert, who at that time had returned to Europe from Japan, where he was working as a professor of literature. And Wilhelm Gundert was steeped in Buddhism and steeped in the traditions of Hinduism, and knew exactly where Hesse was trying to go, and managed to unravel the difficulties, the construction of Siddhartha at that point for him, and stayed with him and worked with him for as long as it took. And hence, the dedications of the original edition were, first of all, to Romain Rolland for the first half, and to Wilhelm Gundert for the second half of the book. So you have a dual dedication. Could we move on perhaps a little, Vandu, with the illustrations? Now, I'll come to this rather attractive woman in just a second. I'd like to just leave the summary of Siddhartha just for a moment. It won't take very long, but it's an important thing. But I'd like to dispose of what happened to Hermann Hesse up to this point, which is really the important point of his life, really. And while he's writing, or trying to write Siddhartha, he's happy, he's calm, except for one stage during 1920 where everything just falls apart again. You can't write, you can't do anything. It's this awful seesaw that pursues him, this awful seesaw life. And it must have been incredibly difficult for a creative man, a man of genius, really, to cope with. At the same time, trying to be a good family man, trying to look after his sons, his children, and always trying to see how much further down the road he would manage to get on this journey to self-realization, self-fulfillment, self-understanding, and above all, the eventual abandonment of self altogether. He wanted to get to a stage which he thought he could have got to in India before he began to write Siddhartha, a stage where he didn't have to search anymore, where he realized that searching was actually not the way forward, that he had to learn to go forward, but to search without searching, in fact, to let it happen. And that he found obviously extremely difficult. But he realized for him that was the way. So eventually and inevitably, he and Maria, his first wife, divorced in 1923. At that point, their children were farmed out to relatives and friends. It's a most extraordinary way of dealing with his family. Hesse himself lived alone for the next 5 years, and for quite a lot of that time at a health spa Baden, not far away from Geinhofen. And there he didn't do very much except scribble a little bit of poetry and so forth. But that came later. But let's think for a moment about Siddhartha. He'd got an idea in his mind. He knew what he was going to do, and he could see the thing evolving in his mind. He could picture Siddhartha, the handsome young prince, the Brahmin, the son of the Brahmin. And he simply followed his own path. He transferred himself straight onto the character. So the boy is brought up, the young man is brought up in great comfort, in an intellectual and spiritual family. His father is very kind. His mother remains somewhat. She's a kind of eminence grise in the background. But his father really cares for him. And eventually, Siddhartha tells a close friend, Govinda, who simply adores him, worships him really, that it's time to give this life of ease and so forth, give all that up. And he's going to set forth and go on a journey of self-discovery. He wants himself, he wants to see the self die, as Hesse puts it. He wants to annihilate self altogether, and hence the beginning of the journey. And of course, Siddhartha's father is not at all happy with that. He had hoped that his son would continue and follow him as a spiritual and intellectual Brahmin, to think carefully about his life, but to remain with the family. And eventually, just by standing his ground, very literally, not moving, was like a pillar in his father's room for a day or a day and a half, his father realizes that Siddhartha is serious, and he comes and he gives him his blessing, which is really important, which I'm not sure that Hesse's own father, Johannes, did. This, incidentally, to revert just for a moment, at the time that he started with his treatments with Joseph Lang and Jung, this was really also on the moment when his father died. And the death of his father was just as catastrophic for Hesse as his mother's death 14 years before. But in this case, with Siddhartha, Siddhartha left home in much more harmonious circumstances. He didn't have to worry about leaving his father and mother anymore. Not that he would have done. He would have done it anyway, as he told Govinda in no uncertain terms. But he set forth, and he tried to achieve his goal by joining a band of wandering ascetics, Sramanas. And he starved, he turned into skin and bone, literally, and was pursuing his goal, in a sense, through self-deprivation, but also on an intellectual path. And that, again, he would discover was not the way to do it. And the way of the intellect was not the way to enlightenment. They went on together, Govinda and Siddhartha and Govinda, for some considerable time. And then they were able to meet and spend time with Gautama, the Buddha, and literally listen and attend at the feet of the Buddha. And Siddhartha, both the young men, Siddhartha and Govinda, were absolutely enthralled by what they heard. And Siddhartha referred again and again, Hesse referred again and again to the elegance of the Buddha's message, beauty of it, the elegance of it. And eventually Govinda decided that he would give up the wandering ascetic life altogether and follow the Buddha, which he did. Siddhartha was very open and explained that he would do his utmost to follow the Buddha's precepts, which he admired, but that he must do this his own way. He couldn't be a follower. he had to be completely independent. And you see this streak of independence through all the characters in his various novels, this repetitive element of independence. And so the Buddha, who had no intention, as we all know, no intention of attracting to himself followers and saying, but you must do this, you must be part of the institution of Buddhism, and you must follow me at all costs. It didn't work like that. So Siddhartha found himself released from any sense of obligation that he might have felt to begin with at that time in meeting the Buddha, and continued upon his way. And thereafter he experienced all sorts of other, as we know, pleasures and displeasures for good or evil. He crossed a river. He came to a town. He met a courtesan, a beautiful woman, more beautiful than he'd ever imagined possible. And she was called Kamala. And writing about Kamala, one feels that Hesse might have been thinking about Ruth Wenger, his second wife, the wife of a famous German novelist, who really was very pretty by the standards of any standards really, but particularly by the standards of the time. And a failed marriage again. They were married for 5 years. They went their separate ways. But that comes later. I'm sorry, this is a reflection. I better sort of just run through this very quickly, if you'll forgive me. We should have mentioned this earlier. When Hesse was in his aesthetic and romantic period, he was obviously influenced particularly by Novalis, but also by Schiller, I think by Schiller, Goethe, and Schopenhauer, and of course Nietzsche, the ubiquitous Nietzsche. So we can be, and then following all of that, and after his being demobbed from the army, as we would say, in the First World War, a few years after that, he had treatment from Carl Jung, and I think that was in Zurich. And this comes a bit later in the story, but after Siddhartha, that's Hesse with his third wife, the love of his life, Ninon Auslander, who remained with him until his death. And they were like two birds on a branch. They were completely inseparable. And you can see, he looks happy, he looks relaxed. And Ninon just looks exactly what she is. She was an art historian, so she knew about that side of his life, but she understood his writing too. And above all, understood him, which was an achievement, I'd say. But coming back to Siddhartha, Hesse learned the arts of love and all the sensual pleasures of life from Kamala, the courtesan. Kamala, whose name, I believe, in Hindi means lotus, so very appropriate. And Siddhartha's never had any contact with a woman beyond talking to his mother and his sisters and that sort of level. And he asks Kamala, because she's so beautiful, he says, can I kiss you? He doesn't quite know why he's saying this. He's not very sure at all about what's going to happen. And she said, well, why should I kiss a wandering beggar like you, a samana who's come straight out of the forest? I've no reason. You'll have to do better than that. You'll have to have something to give me. Have you any skills? And he said, well, I can think, and I can wait, and I can fast. And she said, well, that isn't much good to me. And what else can you do? And he said, well, come to think of it, I can write some poetry. Shall I write a poem for you? Kamala, incidentally, again, is a footnote. And the footnotes are always such fun. Kamala's name is synonymous with Lakshmi, who was the subject, of course, of the opera by Delibes, and was famously sung in Paris by a friend of Delibes, none other than Alexandra David Neal, during her days as an opera singer. And here again, it fascinates me that Hesse is using Indian names now, the names of deities and the children of deities, if you like, in this rather wonderful way. As I say, Kamala is the lotus flower, or Lakshmi. Kamaswami, whom Siddhartha is directed to. He's a merchant, but Kamala wants him to work to make money so that he can give her presents, in return for which she'll teach him the arts of love, basically, which she does with great success. And he becomes a very successful merchant, so he goes through a totally materialistic, unspiritual, and carnal, if you like, lust-driven period, which he comes to regret later, but doesn't altogether renounce in his own mind. His friend Govinda, who we've spoken of, who we don't see much of until the end of the novel, when they're reunited beside a river, the all-important symbol. Govinda's name simply means he who gives pleasure to the land, to the senses, and to cows. It's rather wonderful, I think. And then, of course, as I say, we move on. Having had his fill of his work as a merchant, materialistic life with Kamaswami, and having really had his fill of the pleasures that Kamala is able to offer him, Siddhartha feels that he must move on, he must go further. And he does this. His life, again, is not working. It's very much, again, a reflection of the author of Hesse. This is how Hesse's life progresses. And so he leaves the town. He comes to the bank of a river, and he gets to a stage, he's reached a stage in his life where he thinks that the only option open to him, Siddhartha, is to take his life. And suddenly, inside himself, inside his head, he lies down and he drifts away into an uneasy sleep. And his sleep is dominated by the sound of Om all the time. And he knows what that means. And when he wakes in a different mood. He's somehow come through that crisis, and in front of him is the river. And he reunites himself with an old ferryman called Vasudeva, who I believe can be interpreted, his name can be interpreted as that of Krishna's father, or at least the son of Krishna, depending. But an important figure. And Vasudeva takes Siddhartha in hand, as it were. Siddhartha works for Vasudeva as a ferryman. Vasudeva gives him everything that he has to give. He says, I've no wisdom, I can't give you wisdom. It's rather, I suppose in a way, rather like Zen, in the sense that if you talk about the thing, you're not going to get it. And I can't, what I know in myself, I can't pass on as received wisdom. It's not like that. But nevertheless, they talk. He explains what the river means, what the river can do, what the continuity of the river, beginning, middle, end. No beginning, no middle, no end. How that relates to what Siddhartha wants to become, what he wants to find, and through Siddhartha, what Hermann Hesse is striving to find. And Siddhartha, whose name, in any case, from the two Sanskrit components of his name, means one who has accomplished an object, or perhaps by extension, who has achieved enlightenment. Maybe that's going too far, but that's what I thought. And after years and years together, Siddhartha finds himself with he has two visitors. First of all, his lover of the past, Kamala, who comes with a child, a boy, who turns out to be Siddhartha's son, whom he's never seen until that moment. And Kamala, and probably Govinda too, are part of a great caravan of people who are going to visit the Buddha, who is dying. And she wants to find the Buddha before he dies. She's meanwhile become a Buddhist herself. She reaches the river. She's bitten by a snake, fatally. Her son shrieks out in despair. Siddhartha and Vasudeva hear his cries, and the Siddhartha looks after Kamala until she dies. He builds her higher and tries to encourage his son, whom he now feels a tremendous bond with, just out of the blue. For the first time in his life, he feels this bond with another human being in this particular way, and he tries to make him stay. And the boy, of course, like Siddhartha himself and like Hesse himself, the boy is determined to make his own way, and everything that Siddhartha represents, be it compassion, kindness, long-suffering, whatever you want to call it, the boy rejects out of hand. He doesn't want to have that. He even says to his father, "Why can't you just strike me? Why can't you be cruel? Why can't you reprimand me? Why do you always have to be patient and good and kind? I don't want that." And so the boy eventually leaves, and Vasudeva's last words to Siddhartha before he retires to his forest isolation is, "Let him go. After all, that's what you have to have in your life. Let the boy go." Eventually, the novel could have ended there. In fact, Hesse thought about stopping the novel at that point, but then he was inspired to put a tailpiece on it, which was the return into Siddhartha's life of Govinda. And Govinda, who has been traveling, was a wandering Buddhist at that time for years and years and years, now both old men. He hears from some companions of an enlightened ferryman, and he must meet him. They don't recognize each other to begin with, but eventually they do, and they come together. And Govinda is completely enthralled, entranced by the change that's come over his friend, over Siddhartha, because Siddhartha is coming close to his enlightenment. He's more or less on the point of achieving that, and indeed does. And he has an extraordinary radiance and peace and comprehensiveness about him, which Govinda finds altogether captivating. He's completely, totally captivated by this. And Siddhartha says, "Govinda, kiss my forehead, come close to me and kiss my forehead." And Govinda is not quite sure what he should be doing, why he's doing this, but he does as he's bidden. He kisses Siddhartha's face, and at once he sees everything. He sees all the faces in the world, all the faces in history, all the faces that anybody could possibly imagine or comprehend, all the fish in the sea, all the trees, the flowers, everything. He realizes that all of these things, everything is as one. Everything is, we're all brothers and sisters, plants, animals, everything. We're all part of just the one thing. And as far as Govinda is concerned, although he doesn't know it for a moment or two, he's on the very final stages of a self-awareness which he interprets as self-enlightenment himself. And as he stands back and looks at his old friend's face, he sees a kind of radiance that he finds is wholly extraordinary and wholly beautiful and wonderful. And there the story ends. And it's a perfect place to end. And if you don't mind, may I just run through these pictures very carefully? And then I want to, if you can bear it, if you give me just a minute to do that, I'd then like to read you 2 or 3 lines of a poem which Hermann Hesse composed one April night in 1961, just over a year before he died. And somehow I felt this little bit of unnoticed verse has a lot to say about the rather imperfect sketch of Hesse and Siddhartha that I've given you this afternoon, the defects of which I'm acutely conscious. But here is Hermann Hesse in his sun hat in his garden, looking very calm, and here he is drawing and painting, or drawing in a way, in the garden. And here's one of his watercolors, which translates, is a rather complicated but remarkably attractive word. Tessener Dorflandschaft. What that means roughly in translation is, Tessener is a resident or somebody who lives in Ticino, which is the cantonment where Montagnola, the village inhabited by Hermann Hesse, is. And Dorflandschaft is simply a rural landscape. So it's a rural landscape painted in 1922, the year of Siddhartha's publication, by a resident of Ticino, in other words, Hermann Hesse. Very beautiful, I think. And then here we have Montagnola, the little village, painted a few years later, in 1929, 2 years before he marries Ninon Icelander, who is photographed, you've seen. And this is part of the lake. I imagine that must be a view from the high ground close to Hesse's house, which was built for him by a friend around about 1930. And another view of the village, possibly from his garden. It shows a little bit of shrubbery there, which suggests that. And what might be a church, a little church tower, and a little church just up in the hill. Very beautiful, aren't they? And Corona is another village in Ticino, not very far from I can't pronounce the name of the place, Montagnola. And this is my favorite of all. I don't know why, it just simply is. Everything works in here. You've got what I described once here in a sort of, I remember for a talk about Nicholas Roerich, and the subject of color came up, and I remember thinking green is calming, blue is calming, and so is green, and yellow and reds have a slightly more vigorous tone, and here Hesse has just done it, and it's beautiful, lovely. I think that's the last one. Oh yes, here we are. And here he is. It's a rather unusual, fairly rare photograph. This was, I see from the legend, it was photographed in 1922, the year before he wrote his final book, the Glass-Bead Game, das Glasperlenspiel, which is a story on its own, which I'd love to tell, but that would be too much to expect this afternoon. But I recommend it. And it's quite unlike his other work. It was the Nobel Prize Committee, recognized that. And so here is a little bit of verse that I dug up, if I may, Desmond, it won't take a moment. And he wrote on this April night in 1961, he wrote, "What you loved and what you stood for, what you dreamed and what you lived through. Do you know if it was joy or suffering?" Well, to me, that says a lot. I hope you agree. That's it.
Well, thank you so much. It was fascinating.
It's a bit of a mixture, I'm afraid, a bit like porridge cooking, Desmond, I'm afraid. Back and forward, back.
Well, it's interesting, but I mean, probably from the Buddhist point of view, but also just the big characters of the period, because he was born, I think you said, in 1870.
Yes, 77.
I mean, Jung was born in 1875.
Yes.
But they had the same influences, which is interesting. It's sort of, it's part of the Romantic movement, really.
Yes, very much.
And it's sort of, the relationship between science and the Romantic movement has always been a kind of difficult one. They never quite figured it, never quite worked it through. But I'm sure there are questions from the. I haven't got any questions yet. No questions? Well, let me just stand up and see if I can entice some of our audience to ask a question. Anyone from the floor would like to ask a question? I mean, one sort of obvious question is that, people who have mood problems, for example, he had considered to have bipolar 2, this sort of switching in mood. You could also say that that Nietzsche had certain difficulties there, and many poets actually do suffer or have suffered historically from bipolar disorder, and it's the place that I guess that art and inspiration and so on play in actually getting people normalized, into the real world, into the ordinary world. But I think the other side of it is that because Jung dealt with this really quite well, was the way in which traditional religion had a great anxiety about the body. And the body was seen as something hostile and something you needed to escape from. And that fed into problems with, bipolar disorder, because people are always scrambling into ideas, into the mind to escape from the realities of the body. Jung wrote quite a lot about the problem of evil. And I think what he's sort of saying in many ways is that actually what is seen as evil in Christianity is the body with all its strange things that go on in there. And of course, Buddhism, it's all really about the body and not the mind. It's about really coming at together with the body. Anyway, these are just sort of thoughts from me.
They're fascinating thoughts, Desmond, because the separation between the body, between the mind and the brain.
Yes, and the brain.
And of course, being regarded as somewhat different things. And of course, I think what you said about the influence of these things on other writers and so forth, I think Schlegel, for example, had a great influence on one of the Lake poets, Coleridge.
Yes.
And Coleridge had problems, obviously, but he found sort of comfort and solace, really, a sense, an explanation through the Romantics, the older Romantics. I'm not sure if Schlegel actually was the right one. It might have been Novalis, but anyway, they approached things in much the same way. And of course, not to forget the 17th century, whose name I always whose name I always forget. It's gone from me. The famous one, who said, wasn't it he who said, "I think, therefore I am." Descartes,
yeah.
Of course. That's right. Cognito,
Yes,
ergo sum.
Yes, that's it, yeah. Whereas a Buddhist would say, I exist, therefore I think,
Exactly.
Reverse it around the other way.
Exactly, so a complete inversion.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm just curious what happened to, was he alive during the Nazi period?
Hermann Hesse.
Yes.
Oh, very much so. In fact, he helped Thomas Mann and another friend, Bertolt Brecht, to get away for the oncoming war. And but he was in Switzerland, of course, from 1923. He had taken Swiss nationality at the time his marriage failed, and he had moved to Ticino. And but he stuck it out in Switzerland. But he railed against war and everything that war meant. But he didn't involve himself with the Second World War. Of course, he's much older too, and by no means in good health. But he didn't involve himself in the Second World War as he had in the First, the same way that he had in the First World War. But the Nazis, the whole Nazi thing had a terrible effect on him. Justice, indeed, I suppose, is an extraordinary way that people who supported Francis Galton's theory of eugenics, of viticulture, and sensible people like Julian Huxley, Winston Churchill, Mary Stopes, and the whole list of them, but what they could have thought when the Nazis subverted eugenics into its worst and most despicable and awful form, as they did. So it just shows how well-meaning people, really intelligent people, wise, compassionate people can be so completely led astray. And perhaps not even led astray, but just find themselves facing the complete obverse of what they had held to be a perfectly valid belief or system of belief. Complete nonsense, that wasn't it, Desmond?
Oh no, I was thinking about his bipolar disorder. Actually,
I'm so sorry.
Because one of the things about bipolar disorder is you have this strong belief that there's something out there that will solve your problem. Hence all the irritation and anger that's associated with it, because you can't get it.
Terrible frustration.
But the fixed idea that there is something there
Yes.
that you can have and that will solve your problems is you know is one of the sort of features of somebody who's having a manic episode. You know, they actually feel when the true mania takes place that they've actually got it. You know, that
So would you say
they've
then,
understood
Desmond,
it.
would you say, Desmond, therefore, that's fascinating, because would you then say that Hesse's search and his search for himself with enlightenment, for fulfillment, and all the rest of it is related in that way to his...
I think so,
Very
yes.
directly.
But you know, whereas the Buddha categorized the different types of desire, you know, into desire for oblivion, a desire for fame, a desire for pleasure, essentially, to be someone or to be something, desire for non-existence, which at one phase he seems to have gone through that,
Yes.
where he wanted to, the suicidal sort of elements, all the ablation of the self, to get rid of it altogether. And, the idea of physical pleasure,
Yeah.
or pleasure of one kind or another will actually
Yes.
solve your problem.
Yes.
And desire, of course, in bipolar disorder is very much kind of aggravated and charged, highly charged. When someone's in a manic phase of their madness, So, someone who's really suicidal, for instance, will do everything to commit suicide. You can't stop them often.
Hess tried more than once.
Yeah, I'm sure,
Considering
yeah.
he had several attempts. But I think the one time, perhaps, that he found a kind of physical satisfaction in that sort of sense, where all the senses were being catered for, not least of all the visual sense, was during his second marriage to Ruth Wenger, who was beautiful, undoubtedly, but she didn't have the spiritual and intellectual content. Her beauty didn't embrace that, whereas Nina Auslander, who was a relatively plain woman, but she had all of it. She had what he wanted, but it was through and through and through. And so I think that's why it maybe lasted.
Well, I think in the story of the Buddha, the legend of the Buddha, or Buddha's life, he had all the pleasure to begin with, all the physical pleasure.
Yeah.
And I mean, there is a temptation to think that the Buddha became depressed, because he had he'd experienced a great deal of pleasure, potential for power and authority and so on, but it didn't mean anything to him. What he did feel was a kind of intense sadness, and that made him, was intense sadness for people and for life, when he saw them chasing after things that were pointless, that made him leave his father's palace. There was a feeling of, whether that sadness is a kind of depression, but you could look at it like that. I mean, Nietzsche's depression was, I think, brought on, his final madness was brought on when he saw a horse being whipped in the street, and then the horse couldn't pull the carriage, and eventually collapsed. And the man kept beating the horse, and that was so painful to Nietzsche. And I think it probably epitomized what he thought was the kind of madness of human ambition, that drive that just beats people on and on and on for no reason at all.
That's an incredibly, I think that's terribly important story, really,
Yes.
the question.
Please. Please.
Can I just ask a little bit more about the bipolar and how he sort of dealt with it? Because from what you said, when he was a teenager, it sounds like it was very bad. But somehow he managed to get it under control in his maybe 20s and 30s and focus more on his writing and actually produce, work throughout a quite consistent period of time. So was he helped by just the kind of talking therapies, or was there medication, Did he how did he manage to get it more under control as he got older, which is what it sounds like from what you said about his life?
That's a terribly important question. I'm not sure I feel qualified to answer that. Desmond, is that one for you, or
We've gone, haven't we?
Oh, they've gone. Oh, what a pity.
But
question here, so.
Oh, yes.
There is not one. There's one question there online in the chat. I just unplugged the screen, so it's not for Zoom. This is for the room. So I got one question here.
Yes. Well, look, I can give you. Can I give you an totally amateur, sort of layman attempt to answer that question? Because in no way am I qualified to do this, and you are, Desmond. But would it be reasonable to say that what he had received from, first of all, from Joseph Lang, Jung's disciple and student at that time, and then from Jung himself in 1921, while he was still writing Siddhartha, incidentally, that what he claimed, what he said he found as a result of that, Hesse found, was that he was encouraged to confront the possibility of what was happening inside his mind, his psyche. And he had never done that before because nobody knew enough about it, let alone Hesse himself, to even think in those terms, because he had never had psychiatric help. And his ordinary sort of village doctors and his family and so forth had no idea how to deal with this when he was young. But as he grew older, as he found experience, the experiences, perhaps the catastrophic experiences of the First World War and everything that was doing, and everything it was doing to his country and to himself and so forth, the horrors of all of this, not quite the same as Nietzsche's sight of the horse being whipped as it lay there on the road, but in the sense seeing a whole nation being whipping itself or being whipped by hatred and every horrible manifestation of war. And so that and his father's death had triggered the move to get help. And this is why he first of all got in touch with Lang, and Lang did what he could for him. And then Lang recommended that he should see Jung, which he did, and Jung was delighted. And indeed, Jung was probably a very important influence on Hesse's writing from that stage forward. And he didn't hesitate to take credit for novels such as Demian and Klingsor's Last Summer, and to some extent Siddhartha, and of course, most notably the Steppenwolf, the story of Harry Haller, and who was, my God, a conflicted man, if ever there was one, and he was the epitome of conflict. So all of these things were really, all of these were aided and sort of, if you like, illuminated for Hesse by his friendship with Carl Jung.
I think that's true, but it's also worth remembering that Jung himself suffered from psychiatric disorder. You know, when his mother died when he was young, he became quite depressed, and at school he wasn't functioning terribly well, and doctors were called in, and Jung overheard a doctor saying, if we can't get him right now, he's finished. You know, that's the end of him. So at that point, Jung records in his own autobiography, he said he suddenly decided to change, and then he became an avid student and always came top of the class. But I think he kind of flipped into thinking well, this is just speculative, you know, that he flipped into a kind of manic phase in which he remained really until he had a breakdown following his split from Freud. And by this time he was much older and had already worked at the Berghosli. There was a photograph of him there outside the Berghosli Hospital, which was the foremost psychiatric and most advanced psychiatric hospital in Europe. And it was using techniques way ahead of anything you could possibly think of in England or in France or anywhere. It was really, really advanced. And the director of that hospital was a very extremely gifted man. Anyway, Jung worked there. And that's where he worked out the lie detector test. You know, he used the lie, and the lie detector, which is now used in America all over the place, for, you know, criminology and so on, you know, was actually developed by Jung, because he was trying to understand the nature of repression, and he did that by using skin conductivity. You know, when there was a speeding up of the conductivity, a spike on the thing, it suggested a certain anxiety about things, and so he was able, and it's recorded in his book how he asks various questions to patients, and you know, it becomes apparent that a woman has done. I mean, there's one very clear one where a woman actually gives some water from the bath to her child, and the water has typhoid in it, and the child dies, and the woman becomes very depressed. And Jung is trying to figure out what her depression's about. So he gives her just a series of words like water, bath, baby. They occur in the list, and where all these words have, you know, spike up on the skin conductivity, he realizes they all link together. And it turns out that she has a lover who she wants, but she doesn't want to have the burden of the baby. So without thinking about it, she just gives the child contaminated water that kills the child and leaves her free and to be with her lover. But, you know, she falls into a profound depression because she can't do that, you know. But it's done through the lie detector that he developed. So Jung was attempting to link the body with the mind, you know, through that. And that all happened in the Berghaus Hospital. But it was after that he had this huge breakdown. I mean, it's quite serious one. And he was roaming the banks of, you know, the shores of Lake Zurich for month after month, you know, while he was going through that.
What sort of state was he in when he met
What?
Hermann? What sort of state Desmond was he in when he met Hermann Hesse in 1920, 21?
It may have been during, I'd have to look up the dates actually and see how they link together. Because actually Hermann would at that time have been 52, wouldn't he? 51, 52.
Yes, pretty much. Yes.
It had been sort of midlife crisis time.
24 years, 45.
Actually, midlife crisis, again, was something that Jung invented. Those of you who know about Jungian psychology, that was a term that Jung himself,
Actually coined.
coined, actually, the midlife crisis. And also the idea of introversion and extroversion. I mean, I don't think one can neglect, I think it's important when thinking about people like Hesse and so on, and also the psychoanalytic movement, is that it came really toward, it was a kind of culmination of the European Romantic movement. You know, and I suppose one could say that the core of the Romantic movement was this belief that within the individual lay a kind of genius. And by that I don't mean that you're exceptionally good at mathematics or something, or a great painter, but there was some unique quality that resided in human beings that in itself contained everything you needed for life, you know.
Yeah.
And that is really key. And that's why people like Hitler and so on were very much against the Romantics.
Oh, yes.
You know, very, very opposed to it.
Yeah.
But I think it's an important thing for us to, because that's where it links in a sense with the Buddha Dharma. You know, the Buddha was able to find himself, and that really came home to himself, and he was then liberated and free. But in European thought, you know, the history of European thought, they hadn't actually got there, you know, in the way in which they did in the Far East. But it is hopeful. I mean, I'm hopeful that some of the things, you know, from Buddhism and so on will sort of get into European thought. But I think where they do come together, and very importantly now, is that in, you know, the value of the individual, the extreme value, or the ultimate value of the individual and their life and their quest is the most important thing as a cultural value in itself. And it supersedes almost everything else. You know, and especially at a time when, you know, autocracies are sort of closing in on the Western tradition. where the individual, even our own culture is now completely contaminated with autocratic ideas, and we're not really conscious of it. Anyway, I don't want to go on too much.
That's absolutely fascinating.
There's one question came in the chat, Alex.
Yes.
It's what do you most enjoy about Siddhartha?
What do I most enjoy about Siddhartha?
Yeah, and could you please share the source of the further lines of the poem you read?
So,
Could you please share the source of lines of the poem that you read?
Well, the one that I read.
Yeah.
Yes, I can. Well, I can help you with that probably even better than the first part of the question. Well, the poem that I quoted, really, or part of which I quoted, was one that was really effectively dictated by Hermann Hesse to his wife Ninon. At that point, she really acted as his. She did everything for him, including serving as his amanuensis in the best way. But that was the source of it, and as I say, his health was failing. He was getting very near the end of his life. And one beautiful April night, spring of 1961, just a year and 2 or 3 months before he died, he suddenly began to write, he began to dictate the poem, wrote a little bit of it himself, but mainly by dictation, and she wrote it down. And why he suddenly did this, I mean, I'm not absolutely certain. I think in some ways it was rather like the poetry or the haiku that Basho wrote at the end of his life. And this didn't have the same, this didn't have the same, if you like, background and reason and origin, but it was what he wanted to do. And it's interesting indeed that he should have expressed himself in poetry rather than in prose, because that was again going back to his early life and to his mother, the first things that had impressed him, the first literary excitements that he had were poetry, which of course again, to pick up in just a very sort of feeble way what Desmond has related so, as I say, so enthrallingly, is the fact that the Romantics and the poetry of the Romantics and the aesthetic movement particularly, the aesthetic movement which first of all excited Hermann Hesse while he was still barely a schoolboy, a little more than a schoolboy, was bound up with the Romantic movement, Schlegel, as we said, and particularly Novalis, and of course poetry. Does that help? You're giving nothing away, Vandu.
The question is from chat, not from me.
Ah, I see. Good. Well, thank you.
I think we probably should bring it to an end.
Yeah, it's getting on.
But all you at home, thank you very much for, in your homes or wherever you are, thank you for coming this afternoon, and you and our audience here today, thank you too. And of course, you. Thank you very much.
And thank you, Desmond, for that wonderful, wonderful postscript, which is rather like the Irishman's letter with all the main and good stuff in the postscript. But
Thank you very much.
Wonderful.
Thank you so much.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed.